So we found a possibility that a lot of these ancient sites, at the time of the Henges, from about 3000 BC onwards, are oriented on two sets of stars, the Cassiopeia in the north and Crux to the south, which are both important, as in they are both within the body of the Milky Way. So it's as if these sites are concentrated on the rising and fall of the Milky Way. So the next question then is, to what extent can we see some kind of religion or mythology suggested in this occurrence? In a future lecture, I'll talk about how I reconstructed the mythology in detail, but for now, I'll just talk about how the idea sort of came to me, and my first thoughts on the idea. Now, this is an image of the Milky Way. It's kind of truncated. Normally, the Milky Way goes from one side of the sky to the other. So you can imagine if that's north there and that's south there. It doesn't really form that kind of perfect bow shape there. But this image is quite important in that it corresponds very closely to an Egyptian image of a goddess called Nut. Now, Nut is a goddess of the sky, of the night sky. She's involved in a creation ritual. She is separated. She originally forms a syzygy, a kind of unity with her brother Geb. They're together, and then they split apart. She becomes the sky, and he becomes the earth. They're separated by the air god Shu. So he's the atmosphere which is between the earth and the sky. Here you can see Geb lying on the ground here, having fallen away from his sister's embrace. And here's Nut forming the sky, very much like that image that we saw of the Milky Way. So she stretches from one horizon to the other. Now, she's associated with the rebirth of the sun and with the rebirth of the dead. From the New Kingdom onwards, her image was painted inside coffin lids. So when you're putting your coffin, you're kind of putting underneath an image of the Milky Way. Now, the goddess Nut ate the sun on the western horizon at night. So there's the sun on the western horizon. And it then travels through her body, through the night sky, to be reborn on the eastern horizon at dawn from her womb. So she's the Milky Way, and the sun travels back through the Milky Way to be reborn the next morning. And the same happens with the souls of the dead. As a dead individual, your soul will enter the mother goddess Nut, who is the Milky Way, to be reborn as a star. So the early Egyptian religion is very stellar oriented, and we saw how the pyramids that were built to kind of shoot the soul of the pharaoh into Orion and to become reborn as a constellation. It's a similar kind of image here. She's also depicted as a cow, normally a white cow actually. But here you can see if her mouth is kind of the western horizon, then the solar boat is swallowed by her, and then it journeys through her body. You can see the stars aligned here along her belly. That's the Milky Way being held aloft by Shu, the air god, and then reborn here on the eastern horizon the next morning. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we start to see parallels with Neolithic traditions in Britain. The same cow goddess goes by the name of Mehet Weret, which means the Great Flood, and she's associated with the western bank of Thebes and with graves. So here we have this building here is actually a tomb, and here she is a sort of protectress of the tomb. But this white here it's also the Milky Way, but also the River Nile. So she's got a connection with the flooding of the Nile, but also the Nile in the sky, which is the Milky Way. So we have cow goddess, who is associated with the dead and rebirth, with the river on earth and in the sky. And this tradition probably dates right back into Neolithic times, 4000 BC, perhaps earlier, perhaps going back to a Near Eastern tradition which arose 7000 BC, maybe earlier. But this same connection between a female figure, cows, and graves and rebirth is found in megalithic tombs throughout Europe, spreading all the way from sort of Sardinia through France to Britain. And so when we return to Newgrange, which is the passage grave we looked at earlier, aligned on Sirius and the midwinter sunrise, we find that its name in Irish is Brún na Boine. Now, Boine, change pens here. Boine comes from, sorry, I flicked onto the wrong slide. It means womb, Bru is womb, and Boine is white cow, the cow goddess Boyne. Now, she becomes the River Boyne. There's a myth in which she, which I'll talk about in future lectures, so I won't go into it here, but she drinks from a well, the well floods, and she drowns in the river, which becomes named after her. But also, the Milky Way is named after her. Boha na Bofinna means the path of the white cow. So just as in Egypt, you have the white cow associated with tombs, the Milky Way, and the flooding of the Nile, you have exactly the same images in Irish myth surrounding the passage grave at Newgrange. So it's almost as if we're looking at the same bovine cow goddess that we saw in Egypt. It's been carried to both places with the advent of farming. So it's a very old tradition, and as I said, associated with the sky, with the Milky Way, and with rebirth. So if going into the coffin in Egypt is to go into the body of Nut, so in Neolithic Ireland, if you go into Brún na Boine, go into the womb of the white cow, which is what the people buried in Newgrange would have done. Maybe that too was to somehow bring about some kind of rebirth for those individuals, a rebirth associated perhaps with the Milky Way, perhaps the stars, perhaps the souls of the dead somehow ascended into the sky to join with the ancestors, maybe to come back again at some point. Now, there's some hint of this in the layout of the design of Newgrange. The curb around the front of Newgrange is a reconstruction. Originally, when they excavated it, they found a kind of apron of stones collapsed around the outside like so. The wall-like revetment that has been reconstructed probably didn't exist in reality. But it looks as if we're at Newgrange, the front of the monument, it's seeming to ape the curve of the Milky Way in the sky. So Newgrange as womb of the white cow is literally the Milky Way on Earth, overlooking the river. Again, let's go back to Stonehenge, where we have the entrances which are aligned along the Milky Way, but which also apes the roughly the kind of weave of the Avon nearby. So as above, so below. The river in heaven and the river on earth are both referenced in the opening, in the entrances of the site. And so to go into Stonehenge, are you in fact entering the body of the goddess? Is this why those ancient Welsh cremations were brought there in the first phase of Stonehenge? Is it a monument to the dead? And again, I saw this at the majority of sites. I looked at this alignment of entrance, river, and Milky Way. Again, at Fornox in County Meath, this aligns on the rising of Cassiopeia. And the setting of Crooks, and the local river nearby is the same orientation as is the Milky Way as these stars are rising and setting. And this seems to dictate whether a site concentrates on the rising of Crooks or the setting of Crooks. It seems to depend on the location of rivers in the vicinity. So if the river is to the west of the site, then in order for the sky to match the ground, you've got to wait till Crux is rising. Whereas if the river is to the east of the site, in order for the site on the ground to match the orientation of the heavens, you have to wait till the setting of Crux. So it seems to be an attempt to best mirror the heavens and the earth. Now, there does seem to be evidence for a kind of Milky Way goddess in prehistory, and we will have a full lecture on tracing this goddess across from the Near East into Britain. There's these plaster star-covered breasts from inside of a house in Neolithic Switzerland, for instance, which seem to be a kind of depiction of a goddess on a wall covered in stars. So suggestive of this kind of star-covered figure, like the Nut. And then we have a number of ancient goddess figurines from about 7000 BC onwards, found from kind of the Balkans throughout, spreading through Europe towards Britain. And they seem to have this lozenge or diamond kite-shaped pattern on their wombs. It's kind of an image which may be a womb or a vulva, and it's found on all these different female figurines. Whether they're goddesses or not, we don't know, but they're definitely female, and they all seem to have the diamond and the 4 points, which is suggestive. Here's a load more. The stars of Crux. Now, remember at the start when I said about how Wayland's smithy, the chamber, may have been the entrance itself was delineated by the rising and setting of Crux, and perhaps it was to do with death and rebirth. Well, I think it's actually associated with the womb or the reproductive organs of the female Milky Way goddess of kind of British equivalent of Nut, whereas the W of Cassiopeia are the breasts of the same goddess. So we have the lozenge and the W. So where we have the Egyptian figure of Shu separating the goddess, he has one hand on her sort of nourishing breast and the other on the life-generating womb, which correspond to perhaps Cassiopeia and Crux on the horizon. So are we looking at a Milky goddess in Britain? And I think we are. We have this same symbolism found on anthropological figures found in tombs in Britain. Here are the two stars, and here is a figurine found in the passage grave of Bar Claudia de Gowres on Anglesey. It's a bit damaged, but there was possibly a second kind of eye here. So we have an anthropomorphic figurine with two eyes, and then we have the womb on the belly and the W of the breasts. She's kind of situated here in the passage. The passage is pointing to the setting of Cassiopeia and the rising of Crux. And here, overseeing the whole lot, is this goddess figure. And the multiple kind of forms of the lozenge and the W is almost suggestive of the rising or setting these stars. So I think this figure represents a Milky Way goddess, the equivalent of the Egyptian Nut, worshipped in the Neolithic period in Britain. And I will look in more detail at her in future lectures. And I think that's us just about done. Thank you.